delighted to welcome you to our final event in celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, an annual tradition at the School of Social Work. Today, we're going to have a conversation about Latin America, human rights, and local politics. The purpose of the panel discussion is to provide a forum to highlight the contributions of Latin America in the formulation of human rights as an international framework to address injustice, and to highlight some of the avenues Hispanic and Latino communities have used to fight for a more just world. Our panelists today will address the history of Latin America's involvement in the development of human rights instruments, Latin American innovations in collective litigation, and here locally, human rights issues pertinent to the communities in Connecticut, particularly ahead of the coming elections. Our passionate experts will highlight the past, present, and future implications of collective and democratic action within a human rights framework. I want to thank the Hispanic Heritage Month Committee, a group of faculty, staff, and students for their work in putting together this entire event. Thank you for supporting our efforts. We encourage you to continue and engage in the diverse array of programs that the School of Social Work offers throughout the year, and look forward to connecting with you there. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderators for the day, Lucas Champagne, Ph.D. student, and Lisa Workmeister Rosas, associate professor here at the school. Welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you. My name is Lucas Champagne. I'm a second-year doctoral student at the School of Social Work here at UConn. I'm just here to introduce your panelists. We have a lovely panel here for you today. We've got Dr. James Cavalarro, who is the Executive Director of the University Network for Human Rights. He's also a visiting professor at UConn, at Wesleyan, and recently at the Yale Law School. And he's the former commissioner and president of the Inter-American Association on Human Rights. We have here Emily Luna, who's a graduate of UConn, got her degree in political science. She works for at the Office of the Lieutenant Governor and was elected to the Manchester Board of Education for an appointment running through 2023. And then lastly, we have Angel Oquendo, who teaches here at the law school. He's the George J. and Helen N. England Professor of Law at UConn, and also author of Latin American Law. So I will hand this over to Lisa, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bienvenidos y buenas tardes. Very excited to have our wonderful panelists here tonight. And so we're going to start off with Dr. Cavalarro. And the question that we have for you tonight is, can you speak to the contributions of Latin America to the development of human rights framework and practice? So what is unique about the Inter-American system?
Okay, thank you and welcome to all. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to be part of this UConn event since I'm teaching at UConn this academic year. Let me begin by saying that the contributions of Latin America to the human rights movement, to the human rights framework, to human rights organization are so widespread and so significant that it would be impossible to study or understand the contemporary legal framework, the contemporary framework in terms of treaties, or the contemporary human rights movement globally and in countries around the world without appreciating the role of Latin America. It's beyond central. The narrative of human rights in the post-Second World era is a narrative of Latin America, of the difficulties, of the coups, of the violence, of the resistance, of novel thinking, of lawyers, of non-lawyers, of social justice activists. that is the narrative of human rights. So I'm going to try and defend that bold position in the 9 minutes that I have remaining. And I'm going to present a few screens just to give a visual aid, and hopefully this will be large enough for people to see, but we'll find out in a second. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Host! If host could enable participant screen sharing, I'll start. But I'll start anyway, and we'll jump into the slides as we can.
Try again.
Okay, take two. Success. Great. Can folks see this, my screen? Yes.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay. So let me speak, if I can, about several moments and several avenues of the influence of Latin America on first the human rights framework. To begin with, the UN Charter, the dominant and unfortunate and inaccurate narrative is one that focuses on Eleanor Roosevelt, the four freedom speech, and the role of Western powers in the United States in the development of the UN Charter in general, and its limited, unfortunately limited, focus on human rights. And that narrative, I think, is largely inaccurate. It's inaccurate because the US, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and the Truman administration, was largely constrained in how far it could push for any meaningful human rights terms or oversight in the Charter because of the relationship that the governing authorities in the United States had with Dixiecrats in the South, who did not want to cede any control over their election machinery, over Jim Crow, nor to allow for anti-lynching laws. And so the initial drafts of the UN Charter, the first draft had no references to human rights. Later, one is incorporated, but at the United Nations Conference on International Organizations in San Francisco, where 20 Latin American states are present among 50 Latin American states, and where they push for inclusion of human rights, eventually 7 references to human rights, among them the creation of a Human Rights Commission, the Lone Commission, required by the UN Charter, are incorporated into that document. And I won't go into much detail, we can do this on Q&A, but the role that Latin American states played in that was essential, one. Second, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is generally understood as the cornerstone, the principal instrument of the post-war era that frames the future human rights commitments that will be disseminated around the globe. And while that's true descriptively, what's lost in most narratives is the vital history of Latin American states in framing and shaping the rights included in the Universal Declaration. And this is done largely in parallel, but also directly through the framing of the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, which is drafted in parallel and is finalized before the Universal Declaration and has many innovations. One is amparo en tutela, that idea in Article 8 of the UDHR, but there are others. A focus on economic, social, and cultural rights, which is important and which is incorporated almost entirely in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, again, approved by the General Assembly of the UN in December 1948, but whose Latin American fingerprints are absolutely unmistakable if you look at the two documents side by side. Next, let me see if I can, great. Second thing we want to look at in terms of understanding Latin American history briefly, but its impact on human rights, is the period between 1948 and the early 1970s, which is a dormant period in terms of development of human rights. It's the period in which there is the Cuban Revolution, in which the two covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is drafted. It's eventually enters into force in 1976. It's a period in which the United States is deeply involved in working with Latin American states to limit and control revolutionary and transformative social movements. And it's a period in which you begin to see coups, particularly in the Southern Cone, that are going to transform Latin American history and the history of human rights. First one in Brazil in 1964. Probably more important as a marker is September 11th, 1973, the first September 11th in Chile, in which a socialist president who is elected is overthrown with the complicity of the United States government, and then Argentina in 1976. I'm going to talk about Argentina a bit more in the next few slides, but I just want to tee up the way in which human rights is birthed in Latin America. And human rights, not just now as legal frames and treaties, but the social movements pressing for human rights. So again, I flagged the coup in Chile. An important and ugly bit of history is that in Argentina, in part because of the pushback and the outrage over the coup in Chile, because of its gross violations of human rights. This is a picture of La Moneda being bombed, mass detentions, so many that they're holding people in the national soccer stadium. The Argentine government focuses in its repressive efforts on forced disappearance. And forced disappearance is a crime that is designed to eliminate accountability by eliminating any evidence of the existence of the crime. And it forces and leads and structures the human rights movement in Latin America. How? What's vital with forced disappearances, first and foremost, is documentation. Documentation led by those directly affected, from the grassroots. Family members, mothers, abuelas, de Plaza de Mayo, are documenting, and they're working in a loose transnational advocacy network that is created largely to bring together the grassroots movements in the South with points of pressure in the North. This is written about, and I give these sort of the arrows here, flowing documentation through transnational advocacy networks, pressure on powerful states, pressure on target state change. Keck and Sickink write about this, and you can study this. There's a lot written on this, but it's the idea of the boomerang effect, where when there's blockage in a country, there's recourse to international forms of pressure to eventually change the actions of the target state. Again, if we look at the creation and the development of the human rights movement, there's a picture here of the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, a group of directly affected rights victims coming together to advocate for human rights in frames that are originally about leftist solidarity, they're about family, they're about justice, they're about abuse, but they become the narratives of human rights. And they become the basis of the formation of civil society organizations in Latin America, a process that then is replicated in many ways, obviously with local adjustments, modifications, et cetera, in other parts of the world. But the leader in the formation of civil society organizations fighting for human rights is Latin America. Another important development that I want to flag is the unexpected and vital role of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, a body formed within an organization, the Organization of American States, controlled by authoritarian states, but which is remarkably independent and committed to human rights and plays an essential role in pushing back against the worst atrocities of the authoritarian regimes of the 1970s and 1980s in Latin America. I also want to flag the role of the Inter-American courts, and I'll just mention one case, but before that I'll talk about, and we have the expert here, so I'll just flag this, the constitutionalization of human rights, the way human rights are incorporated into the constitutions in Latin America that are developed after the transitional period. And Angel Oquendo is an expert on Latin American law, so I won't say more other than to flag that that is an important phenomenon, that human rights, the legal framework permeates the law within Latin America. I also wanted to flag the Velasquez-Rodriguez case, which is essential. It's a case about forced disappearance in Honduras in the 1980s. But what's vital about it is the way the court holds Honduras is responsible is by accepting the possibility that the Honduran authorities were not directly responsible as a legal matter. And by accepting that legal possibility, it develops a jurisprudence to hold the state accountable for the actions of third parties. That idea, which is revolutionary in the 1980s, allows for the idea of corporate social responsibility, holding human rights accountable, and it allows for the idea of women's rights as human rights, which should be obvious to all of us now, but was not obvious in the 1980s. to the extent that those directly violating women's rights were non-state actors, were their partners, were others in the home, in the private sphere. And finally, one last enormous contribution to human rights from the Americas is the idea of accountability. The phrase "no a la impunidad" is a phrase that you couldn't even translate it into English in the 1980s, in the early 1990s, when that was the call. No to impunity. It really doesn't ring in English. It's born in Latin America, and it's born of the transitional process, which is vital first in Latin America, but then around the world. Transitional process from authoritarian regimes to more democratic regimes. The creation of truth commissions, which is again a Latin American phenomenon predominantly, but we may think of the South African Truth Commission, or we may study it. But again, the origins, Latin America. And finally, the importance of accountability and the human rights framework in Latin America is the Colombian peace process, all of which took place clearly framed by and in the shadows of international human rights law developed in Latin America, so that Colombia, when it gets to its transitional process, it has to do it within a framework that is acceptable in the international oversight norm structure that has been created by Latin America itself. So let me wrap it up there. I think I've gone a bit over 10 minutes. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to hearing our next speakers.
Great, thank you so much. It's so important to learn about the history of social movements and the ways that we've gotten to a place where we've been able to recognize the human rights that are being violated and really begin to have some kind of systemic way of keeping track of them and holding states accountable. So thank you for that. If you don't mind, I'm gonna ask if we can go to Dr. Angel Oquendo next, because I think it would flow in terms of kind of talking about sort of the larger piece that you've been working on in terms of action, collective action litigation. So, and anything else you want to talk about. So I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Well, Lisa, you're the boss, as I said. So your wish is my command. And I'll start out saying I have good news and I have bad news. A little bit, I assume some of you have heard the joke about the Latin American presidents having a vision of God at night one day, and God tells them the world is going to be over next week. And then the next day, they have to confront the people. And the first one is Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico. And actually, when you tell the story in the original language, you do the accents, but I'll spare you the accents. He holds a speech in the Zócalo of Mexico, and he says, "Fellow Mexicans, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that God exists. The bad news is that the world is going to be over next week." Then it's the turn of the Cuban president, and he holds a speech. He holds a meeting in the Revolution Plaza, and President Diaz-Canel says, "Comrades Cubans, I have bad news and I have bad news. On the one hand, God exists. On the other hand, the world is going to be over next week." And then the third person to speak is the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. And he holds a huge event on TV, and he tells his people, "Dear Brazilians, I have news, 3 pieces of it, and they're all excellent. On the one hand, God exists. Secondly, he came to talk to me. And thirdly, the pandemic is going to be over next week." So at any rate, my bad news is I'm going to have to compress what I was going to say in half the time. So I'm going to kind of machine gun a few issues. But the good news is then that gives you more time then to focus on the issues that you like, and then we can go in whatever direction you choose. So just let me know. I'm very happy that Jim started out talking about the influence of Latin America on human rights since the period after the Second World War, so I don't have to talk about that. I refer to this phenomenon as the internationalization of domestic law, where you had countries contribute to this dialogue on human rights and bring in their domestic legal experience to the international arena. And as Jim was saying, Latin America played a very important role in this process. Then a little bit more of the history that Jim was telling happened, and that is the story of dictatorship and then rebirth after dictatorship into democracy. And a new movement emerged, which is the flip side of the coin. It's the domestication of international law. So with the move towards democracy, there are new constitutions, as you heard, that incorporate not only international law generally, but human rights law specifically. And this law is then part of national positive law, and it's applied in theory by the institutions, very specifically by the courts. And there seems to be an excitement about human rights. And this is a period that starts, of course, in the 90s and goes up to the start of the millennium, and probably up to about a decade ago. There is a lot of movement, a lot of development, very interesting. Once again, I think a lesson for the rest of the world. I was asked to talk a little bit about collective litigation. I'm not going to be able to say much, but I will say that there has been a paradigm shift in Latin America with respect to collective litigation, and a move from group rights to what we could refer to as societal rights, and actually even beyond that. So you have several constitutions that talk about broad environmental and even planetary rights. Very interesting development, very complicated. We can go over some of those matters in the discussion afterwards. And then there is a moment in the decade that just finished where I think the story I was telling at the beginning has a connection that is kind of interesting. And what I see happening in that decade was an intense debate about human rights. And it was a moment in which there was a lot of diversity, a lot of movement, a lot of radical, emancipatory politics in Latin America. You had at least 3 women presidents of important countries in Latin America. You had indigenous leaders become president. You had people who were not from the establishment, from the workers' parties, move into presidential houses. And part of this group started asking for a new vision on human rights. And they started actually very aggressively attacking the inter-American institutions, the commission, and also the court. And I perceive this as a call for the politicization of human rights. And here we have, I think, a fascinating discussion that took place. And I think that it is very important, not just for Latin America, but for the entire world. And one of the challenges underlying this call for the politicization of human rights is to figure out a way in which an ideologically diverse region and world can work together on human rights. And what is the point of reference for everybody? And this is something that I'm fascinated by, I'm very interested in. And it seems to me that one way of approaching this question is by understanding human rights basically as involving principles as opposed to values, principles that to some extent can be characterized by referring back to a very, I might say, primitive, basic kind of right, which sometimes in the law has been referred to as a claims right, and that is a right that is attached to a duty. And what is very interesting, very challenging, and very much part of this discussion that I'm referring to is the fact that there is a component of politics or policy and a component of principle. I mean, everything is a principle, but the realization of the principle, the execution, the substantiation of the principle, in many cases takes place through policy. And one way of achieving the flexibility to allow diversity to come in to the discussion about human rights is to say, well, there is going to be, of course, stricter enforcement on matters of thin core principle. And then on the question of politics or policy, there is going to be more flexibility. And this flexibility doesn't mean that policy is just an aspiration. It's up for grabs, anything goes. I think that there has to be a control, but it's a different kind of control than when the courts or civil society or the commission, in the case of the Inter-American system, are enforcing principles. So, when you go to policy, then there is a different kind of enforcement. It turns on the notion of arbitrariness, but this is not a thin notion in itself, but it's a notion that has teeth and that has to be imposed, that has to be advanced aggressively. And I think that the institutions have a very important role in doing this. And in this respect, I think that one has to be modest. So one should not dream of having a consensus that is going to be able to draw everybody in, irrespective of the ideological background. I think that one has to be realistic and kind of concede that the convergence is going to be relatively minimal. And actually, this is something that can be developed later on if there is interest in this. There are some parallels with the philosophical idea developed in the United States of political liberalism, or sometimes overlapping consensus. But what I'm thinking of is even thinner. This idea, of course, is an idea of US philosopher John Rawls, and John Rawls tries to imagine what he refers to as political liberalism or a political conception of justice. Now, that is going too far. So I think it seems to me that it is very difficult to expect that kind of convergence. But if we have a more limited convergence, then it is possible to create a system, and it is possible to allow the system to develop the notions and to develop the institutions in order to make progress. There is going to be controversy, there is going to be conflict, but it's going to be realistic to expect a system that is functional and not dysfunctional. And in this sense, I would say that the aspiration has to be to come to a point in which there is respect for the structures that are set up, and there is a possibility of those structures attaining autonomy and being able to develop on their own, building on that relatively thin convergence that I'm talking about. So, after that decade, I think that now in this new decade that we start, there are challenges that are very significant. There are different kinds of oppositions that have developed to the Inter-American system, somewhat different from what was seen in the last decade. But you have Supreme Courts in Latin America challenging the Inter-American Court, for instance, and certainly challenging the Commission. And I'm thinking of the case of Argentina in 2017 with the Supreme Court limiting the impact, the effect of the decisions of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Of course, the confrontation with Venezuela has continued, and there has been a peculiar confrontation also with the Constitutional Court of the Dominican Republic. So this is what opens itself up. It's very complicated, it's different, but I think that it is connected to the previous decade and the era of politicization of human rights. And if there is interest, we can go further into this. But I've already gone over my 10 minutes, so I'll stop at this point. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I appreciate what you're saying, and particularly the aspect of the changeover from group rights to societal rights. I think that's really important. And I think particularly in looking at the United States and our history with the civil rights movement, it's an interesting juxtaposition in terms of what are group rights versus societal rights. But I can talk about that later. Yeah.
Just a second, and it'll be a second, really. Yeah. Actually, on this point that you raise, I think that there is a connection with one of the themes of this discussion, and that is the relevance of all of this for Latinos in the United States. Yes. Because in part, these societal rights are relevant to class actions in the United States when Latinos are part of the class action, and we can talk about that later.
Yeah, well, you just set me up perfectly for my question for Emily Luna. I also, before I ask the question, I just want to remind people that we do have a Q&A. So if you have questions, you can start popping them into the Q&A, and we'll certainly do our best to have them answered. So kind of to follow up on what was said, I'm wondering, Emily, as a public official, what human rights issues do you see the Latinx communities are facing today, either statewide, country as a whole, and if you have a sense of how politics and the upcoming election will have an impact on those issues?
Hi, and thank you for having me here, and I'm honored to be as part of this panel along with two great experts. So as a public official, obviously we look at the national level and local level. I can say for the Latinos, issues that I see that stands out the most is obviously immigration, whether that be for undocumented immigrants and then just legal immigrants as well. We saw how on September 28th through October 1st, the Department of Homeland Security and ICE targeted sanctuary cities, particularly in California, and deported immigrants. They accordingly were saying that this was them following CDC guidelines, for COVID, and that they needed to deport them right away. They also try to claim that it was 96% had criminal convictions or pending criminal charges for crimes, whether that be homicide, sexual assault, sexual offenses against children. Fair enough to say, if you have a crime, you should be tried, but every human being has a right to due process, which this due process has been violated for them, and continues to be neglected during the Trump administration. Other issues I do see are access to healthcare, and which particularly we've seen has been exacerbated due to the pandemic, and seemingly it seems that COVID has exposed several issues that we have seen in our communities, but now it's just being blown into proportion for us all to see. I also can speak to the right to education and access to educational resources. As well, with COVID, we've seen how several students that don't have access to technology have struggled to accommodate to the new system of learning, which is virtual learning, and Zoom or any other platform. I also can speak on, I've seen the barring of immigrants with the borders due to COVID, the illegal detentions, the police brutality, which we all seen happen over the years, and just this year has been put at the forefront of social justice. And I also would like to speak about the right to vote, which we see the Trump administration working to suppress the vote, whether it be causing fear or just confusion about absentee voting and mail-in ballots, as he likes to explain to his crowds. Also, I see fair wages for everybody as a human rights issue, whether it be based on gender or race. Here in Connecticut, the minimum wage, they passed the bill, which would raise it to $15 gradually up until June 1st of 2023. This year, it was raised to $12. And then, for gender, women make less than men, white men in particular. I know that Latina Equal Pay Day is October 29th, which is, raising awareness of pay day for all women. Women make 82 cents on the dollar. Black women make 62 cents on the dollar, and Latinas make around 55 cents on the dollar. So they're making way much less than other women in particular, but, we're trying to raise awareness to that issue as well. On the state level, we see a lot of these issues cross over nationwide, but these issues aren't new, and we must keep pushing forward for equality for everyone, regardless of race, immigrant status, and gender. And for politics, I think all of these issues are important because it seems like they're all on the ballot, and I hope to encourage more Latino people to vote in this year's election in particular. And just to bring a couple of key facts is, we're the largest growing voting bloc. And I think this year we're estimated to be 32 million Latinx who will be eligible to vote this year. So, we all have the power to influence an election, whether it be locally or nationally. It seems, most of the times we're focusing on the national level, but here in Connecticut, you can vote for your state representatives, state senators, and even at the congressional level. And these are all issues that affect your everyday lives. As we can see, minimum wage was increased. So if, you're supporting people who support basic rights for us, I think that's something that, Latinos should be focused on. I don't know if I'm going over time, but I'm welcome to take other questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that that's a great way to kind of bring in kind of what is happening currently. And I'm going to start off with a question. We haven't seen any in the Q&A yet, so go at it. But I have a question. So in thinking about the things that Emily said that are really issues right now for the Latinx communities in the United States, how, and particularly about immigration, because that of course has this added element of, citizenship and, where, being documented, undocumented. So, but in general with the issues, how can, the Latinx folks harness, the efforts that have already been made, that have already made a difference, through, Latin America's contributions to the, human rights framework in the beginning, but also going back to the idea of, demanding societal rights rather than the group rights, which I think, again, has something that's really limited. I think a lot of the targeted populations in the United States, and I think the Latinos are certainly one of those. So, what can be done, I guess, in kind of responding to or addressing the particular issues that are most poignant to the Latinx communities today? And whoever wants to start. James, great.
So one thing that I would say, which I think one sees if one studies forms of organization and political engagement of Latinos, Latinx community in the United States, is the cultural and historical mark, or the cultural and historic legacy that Latinx communities and Latinos and Latinas bring from their lives prior to coming to the United States. And let me just flag a few things which I think are relevant, and things that, suggestions that might be useful in the current political context. So first of all, I think in general, folks in the United States tend to have a belief in the capacity of our legal systems and institutions to resolve issues above the level that actual fact would warrant. This is my personal view. In other words, we in the United States tend to think, oh, things will work out. The elections, the votes will be counted. The authorities will act appropriately. The justice system will implement the law, et cetera, okay? On the whole, and this is a gross overgeneralization, but there's some basis in truth, I think folks in Latin America, their default setting for trust in governmental institutions is lower. And that's actually a good thing when dealing with states that have a weak commitment to the rule of law. And I think Latin Americans have done well in pushing for democracy and social justice and human rights when they've pushed against the state, and when their distrust in the state has led them to organize, has led them to take to the streets, has led them to do things that are necessary in systems in which the rule of law is tenuous at best, okay? I think there are lessons there for the current context in the United States. And so what I would say is I think it's essential for folks who are Latinos, Latinas, coming from Latin America to the United States, not to check your identity at the door. We actually need that distrust. We need the mass mobilization, the mass organization, the capacity to doubt, and the willingness to doubt that things will turn out okay if we don't make it turn out okay ourselves. We need that, I think, in 2020 in the United States. So I would just say the harnessing of that experience. Also, one last thing I would say is harnessing the recognition of the importance of supranational bodies. This is a country that has been enormously resistant historically to any kind of international oversight. And I hope and pray in January that a new administration takes over. And I think one of the collective tasks that all of us have will be to hope to press the next administration to recognize international oversight, to stop believing and promoting the idea of US exceptionalism, which is BS, and which needs to die a sudden, ruthless death. I have to say it in those terms, in order for the United States to move beyond the ugly experience that we're living through now. And if you look at any society, and I think we're really in a situation where we should have some sort of transitional government and think about transitions. In Latin America, again, we're talking about truth commissions and transitional justice. Latin America is a leader. We should be thinking about transitional justice. We should be thinking about truth commissions. We should be thinking about ratifying international human rights treaties. We should be thinking about recognizing jurisdiction of international oversight bodies, because if the last 4 years prove anything, it's that we are not able with our own institutions to stop atrocities occurring in this country. We can't stop authorities from legally taking infants from their mothers and fathers. We don't have the wherewithal to do that. We need to look in the mirror and say there's something profoundly wrong with our system. And part of that profound wrongness is its internal self-reliance and its belief that we have all the answers here in the United States. We don't. There's a lot we can learn from Latin America.
A great point. Yeah, thank you. Angel.
Yes, well, the development that we were talking about earlier, as suggested, that is, I mean, the development in terms of human rights in Latin America and human rights being domesticated, so to speak, are related to the historical experience with dictatorship and then democracy. Also, there is a connection with the dysfunctions of ordinary institutions, particularly legal institutions. And therefore, human rights were seen as a parallel or alternative route to achieve certain things that you couldn't achieve through the mechanisms available. And all of this is connected to what Lisa is talking about when she refers to societal rights. I mean, in Latin America, there has been a revolution on this, and in most countries, almost anybody can go to the courts and argue that the interests of the society are not being respected. You can challenge laws as unconstitutional. You can represent the interests of the whole population, of the environment, sometimes even of the planet. As Jim is suggesting, I mean, I think that there is a possibility, and one has to be patient, but there is a possibility of there being an influence in the United States. So, you know, for a long time, the United States has had influence in Latin America, but has not been influenced by Latin America. Well, here there are opportunities. One does not have to be over-optimistic because it's going to take a little while in the United States, but I think that it's bound to happen at some place. And in this sense, then it might be possible to change what exists in US law that makes it so difficult to take seriously the equivalence of these societal rights actions. For instance, the citizen suits in the United States, which have been limited by the precedents of the Supreme Court. Now, there is another impact, which is kind of interesting, and this is developing, so we're gonna have to wait and see what happens. But that is that, you know, when you have a class action in the United States that involves foreigners, and specifically in this case, Latin Americans, be them residents of Latin America or citizens of Latin America, one of the things that the court has to do is figure out whether there is a likelihood that the judgment will be recognized in Latin America. And I think that an education that has to take place and has already started is precisely to point to these societal suits that Lisa is referring to, which go far beyond anything that exists in US law, particularly in collective litigation law, and that make it very likely that courts in Latin America will recognize these judgments. And what this means is that it's going to be possible then for Latin Americans to be part of this effort, to be included in these classes, to get a remedy, and also obviously then to execute, enforce the remedy afterwards. So there is a learning process that needs to take place and that has already begun to take place at different levels. At the macro level, in which you bring this new vision of the law, which is not only to serve individual interests or even group interests, but is about serving the interests of the society as a whole. So you have that macro effect, but then you may have a micro effect in the United States to the extent that this vision of litigation, of collective litigation, can be brought a little bit through the back door to the certification process of class actions in the United States and to the enforcement process in the United States. Thank you.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up on that? And I know, Emily, you said that he kind of covered that, what you were going to say. So just a question. So in terms of thinking about, you know, why these movements were so kind of successful and strong within Latin America, and how the United States, you know, hasn't, you know, been able to kind of gather that kind of momentum with the, you know, Latinx community. I mean, do you see that also as a function of sort of the group versus societal, and or, you know, is there a sense of, you know, because Latinx folks are just, you know, one group within the larger society, that the level of commonality is less, you know, rather than, you know, because here in the United States, we see some people see everyone as an American, some people don't see themselves, you know, but in Latin America, you know, everyone's a Peruvian, or, you know, if you're in Peru, everyone's a Colombian. It doesn't necessarily matter where you came, you know, what your other connections are. So I'm just wondering, because there's a level of cohesiveness in these movements that really doesn't happen in the United States.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a very difficult question. It's a very important question. You know, it seems to me that in the United States, as you're suggesting, in the law, but even beyond the law, there is an obsession of sorts with individualism. You know, there is an interpretation of the Constitution, interpretation of the law, under which it is said that the function is to protect individuals and individual interests. And sometimes then there is a distortion of the history of law in the United States in order to get to that end. So this is a little bit part of it. I mean, there is another story here that is sometimes told, and that is that, you know, the human rights system as it was set up was essentially set up, I would say, under the leadership of the United States at a time in which in the United States apartheid prevailed. So for the system to work for the United States, it had to be a system that functioned abroad, but not at home. So, you know, the United States insisted on everybody respecting human rights, but, you know, when it came to signing, ratifying documents or being part of systems, the United States stayed out. And this connects, I think, with Lisa, with what you're saying. I mean, Latin American societies are very divided, and there is a lot of conflict. But you have a stratification that's kind of different, and that's in many ways, in many places, not legalized the way it has been in the United States. So, you know, in the United States, it's harder to think of the collective than it is in other places, Latin America and elsewhere. So, you know, it's the idea of these societal interests and societal rights has been very hard for US law and maybe the US citizenry to swallow. And therefore, you know, it's probably going to be a very complicated process, but I hear something, Lisa, in what you're saying, which I find very inspiring, and which is that, you know, the Latino community here, the biggest minority at this point, can play that transformative role, that almost Marxist transformative role, bring liberation, not just for itself, but for everybody. So it's not just a question of securing my peace, securing my liberty, but achieving a new understanding of liberty that will actually encompass everybody. And that is something that we can hope for.
All right, and then we also have an audience question that was submitted. This is for Dr. Cavalarro. It says, what do you think the United States needs to do in order to, quote unquote, fix its policies regarding undocumented immigrants, refugees, etc., especially from Latin and South America?
I'm not sure I'm more qualified than the other panelists or anyone else to answer this question, but in terms of international human rights standards, which, as Professor Oquendo was saying, the United States has not ratified, there is a treaty on the rights of migrant workers, for instance, to which the United States is not party. There is an advisory opinion by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights about the rights of migrant workers, which is based quite directly on a Supreme Court decision in a case called Hoffman Plastic Compounds. And that decision sets out state obligations. Basically, a state is required to treat someone in its jurisdiction with the full panoply of rights, subject to certain limitations that are permitted because of the sovereignty of a state, certain kinds of professions, national security, et cetera, can be limited to nationals of a given state. At the most basic level, even under the existing obligations that the United States has and which have not been enforced, there's a very strong case to make, and I make it, that the intentional decision to separate children from their parents, particularly young children, is not just cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, but it's torture, and therefore violates the obligations of the United States under the Convention Against Torture and customary international law that is binding on the United States that prohibits torture. The operation of ICE, I think, is the entire institution is probably a criminal institution and should be disbanded and is not consistent with international human rights standards. Again, many of which the United States does not recognize, but some of which it does. So we're not even close. The arguments that we're having are around the edges of an immigration system, which is fundamentally racist, which deprives people of their core due process rights, the point that Emily made earlier, even if it were legitimate to arrest individuals in roundups based on their non-legal status in the country, what due process is provided to them in the United States? Virtually none. So there are so many levels at which the entire immigration approach to immigration, I think, has to be reconceptualized in the United States if it were to ever become fully consistent with international human rights standards. But at a minimum, stop family separations, stop caging people, putting people in prison for what is really only, is not a crime, but is at best an administrative infraction, being physically present in a place where the state doesn't want them to be physically present. But then down the line, the denial of the due process, the existence of a really uncontrolled racist police force, ICE, all those are elements that have to be done away with. And again, just back to the last point, these are things that we should be getting ready to press for on day one if we have a new administration. And if we don't, we got to dig our heels in and try and stop the onslaught of increasingly ugly authoritarian policies if Trump manages to railroad himself through a second time.
Yeah, and of course, we'll open up this question to anybody else who wants to respond also.
I actually had a question for Emily that kind of connected to kind of what we had been talking about. So when, you know, as we were alluding to before, you know, I think that the United States, you know, I think does a really good job at dividing people, particularly people of different groups, different social groups. And I'm wondering what you see, particularly now with the advent of this political election. Do you see Latinx folks kind of coming together on certain political issues that they want, you know, solved or addressed, or do you see kind of more of a splintered community, you know, with different issues being sort of their primary issues?
I think, to be honest, I still see a bit of a separation between the Latino community, even just on basis of whether, you know, you identify as Democrat or Republican. And that's mostly, I believe, based on your Latin American ancestry. You know, in my view, I see more of the South American countries being more worried about socialism. And if I may address it as that, you know, the Trump administration, that's how they're trying to sway some people to their camp, rather, you know, voting for Biden, who's a Democrat. And then, you know, immigration, that's something that obviously the Republicans don't have any care for at all, as we can see, you know, Trump administration with the separation of children, and then just continuing the bad practices of immigration and ICE. So just long answer short, I kind of do see a bit still of a separation in what matters to some of the Latin American communities within the country.
Great, thank you. I guess I would wonder, you know, well, actually, this would probably be good. You know, Lucas, you had that question that I think is a good kind of follow-up with kind of talking about the Biden, if Biden gets elected, the issue about the super, do you remember that question?
I don't believe that was my question.
Oh, sorry, okay.
I do have one though, if we are.
Well, I thought your question was kind of, you know, if Biden were to be elected, how likely and what would need to happen in order for, you know, can't remember who had mentioned sort of having the super national kind of oversight, you know, kind of because we don't want anyone to tell us what to do, but we need obviously something. So what would need to happen? Because it's not, I mean, we can certainly see the difference in Biden and Trump, but it's also in the US American people who feel like they don't want to be told what to do. So it's, you know, I don't know. So like, what would have to happen? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think, and probably a lot of people would agree, I hope, that we should be careful about our expectations because, of course, we are living in extraordinary times in terms of politics. And there is immense frustration and there is hunger for hope. So, you know, the tendency is to think, well, we'll change the administration and everything is going to be dandy. I mean, to some extent, what we've experienced in the last 4 years has been a strategy in which consists in doing very openly and ruthlessly what has been done for a long time, but you know, with no sugarcoating. And of course, that makes it even more offensive. But I think that it's going to be very difficult to change completely. I mean, now I think that there is hope. I think that the mobilization that we've seen is very exciting. But there is going to be, if there is, you know, as Jim was saying, this is not a given. I mean, if there is a change, then the struggle begins. It's not the end. And it's going to be not, I think, it's not going to be just about changing the rhetoric. You know, if you just come and put someone in the White House who has better manners than Trump, who isn't as trashy as Trump, I mean, that may be nice for our sensibilities, but that's not going to solve some of the basic problems. So, for instance, you know, I remember before this last election, there was a discussion about Mexico and the U.S. policy towards Mexico. And, you know, it's been a very self-centered, a very colonialistic policy forever, and very intensely so during the Obama administration. You know, because of the facade of kind of reasonableness and because of the rhetoric, it didn't seem as extreme. You know, then of course there was the election, the change, and then, you know, the language is racist and open, it's offensive and all of that, and you can't miss it. But you know, we're talking about just a development that consisted in putting an ugly face to something that was an ugly reality to begin with. You know, it's going to be very difficult, and you know, I'm hopeful, but it's going to be very difficult, you know, if there is a change with the new election, to change the situation radically. Because I think that a lot of people are going to think, especially the people in power, okay, we got here, we're not going to be as nasty and as trashy, and that's the end of it. But you know, it should be the beginning, I think. Thank you.
If I can jump in and add something to what Professor Oquendo has said, I agree. Going to be the beginning, and it is far from sufficient to have a president who is less, what's the best term to describe the current occupant, who is less racist, sexist, vile, lowbrow, abusive, offensive, indiscreet, etc. That's a step. Those are all good things at some level. But one of the interesting things, and this is a political commentary, so I'll say this personally, I'm not saying this as an academic, someone who's, I have political views, we all have political views. One of the things that happens in the United States is there's a trend, or tendency rather, for issues that might be part of the bipartisan, long-standing consensus. When that issue is intensified and associated with one party, the other party pushes against it as though it didn't support that same policy in different, less ugly manifestations for decades. And again, one of the areas, for instance, if you look at US absolute unquestioned support for Israel and failure to concern itself as it should with the rights of Palestinians. If you take that issue, over the last 4 years, as I would say, occupation has intensified, folks in the Democratic Party who were generally okay with the Obama administration's maintenance of a policy of support for Israel and underplaying Palestinian rights have moved because they associate Trump with an extreme Netanyahu nationalist position. Okay, now, I'm not going to get into Israeli-Palestinian politics, but just use that as an example. Another example, Obama, the quote-unquote deporter-in-chief, numbers of deportations and number of family separations, not as a deterrent intentionally inflicted on all to reduce migration to the United States, but family separations. When people were subjected to criminal prosecution, they were with their families, they would be held in separate detention centers. Widespread detention, widespread deportation. Now here's the upside. Most folks don't really think much about Obama's immigration policy and deportation policy and family separation as a fact policy. They associate that with Trump. That opens a space, I think, for those of us who are trying to change the bipartisan consensus where it is bad and where it violates rights, to push against that and to push taking advantage of the rationale in American politics, which is the enemy is my friend, or the politics of my enemy are the opposite of my politics. I think we need to think in those terms and be creative. And I do think we need to be maximalist. I agree with Professor Oquendo. We will not usher in moral righteousness and commitment to human rights on January 20th or 21st with the inauguration of Joe Biden. Not going to happen. What I think we do need to do is not to go to sleep, not to think everything is okay, and push as far as we can. And among the things I think we should push for is against American exceptionalism and for greater engagement. And just, even if we don't get the United States to ratify every international human rights treaty and recognize every jurisdiction body, we can stop sanctioning employees of the International Criminal Court. We can stop actively undermining the United Nations and gutting its funding. We can stop undermining the Inter-American Commission, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot that can be done in the short run, but I think we ought to have an ambitious agenda and not, if we could only return to 2016, everything was hunky-dory then. That I think is a recipe for Donald Trump Jr. 2024 in a landslide. So there's my political comment, but just, one guy's opinion.
If I could just quickly just jump in agreement with both your views. I was also going to briefly touch base on, unfortunately, facts are facts, but, President Obama did deport a lot of immigrants, and that's just a fact. But also to touch upon, if, Joe Biden wins, doesn't mean we have to go back to our normal lives and ignore politics forever. It just means we have to pay more attention. It kind of reminds me of like one of the signs that was in the Women's March in 2017, which a lot of people have pointed to this year, which is a lot of people were carrying around signs, which was, if Hillary won, I would have just gone to brunch. And that just means, that people just want to go back to normal and ignore the issues and go around their normal lives. But we've seen with the Trump administration that, if you don't pay attention, they're just going to roll back all these simple rights and any other issues that people care about. So I do agree that, if Joe Biden wins, we obviously have to push back and make sure that he, follows up on his promises that he made during the campaign.
So I was kind of going back historically, but I think that this sort of touches on things in the present too. It's just, we're talking about Latin American contributions to human rights framework and practice, but we haven't talked much about sort of the resistance from sort of the big W West, I guess, where these liberal rights were held such primacy that like the economic and social rights had to be fought for and were not really ratified to the degree that they might have been. So I'm just kind of curious about sort of resistance from Britain, from the United States to Latin American innovation, things that were in the documents written in Latin America that could not make it in to the UDHR, and sort of what kind of a comment that is on US exceptionalism and its sort of orientation towards human rights.
What's interesting, Lucas, if I can, there's a lot in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights in the UDHR, and it's in the American Declaration as well. What happens in terms of the instruments is that almost all of that, all of the content in economic, social, and cultural rights from the UDHR or the American Declaration gets gutted in the American Convention on Human Rights. And the American Convention on Human Rights has articles, has 20 plus articles on civil and political rights, and one article on economic, social, and cultural rights, which, as the expression goes, is more holes than cheese if it were Swiss cheese. And over time, that has been interpreted to provide for some economic, social, and cultural guarantees. But what happens historically is between 1948 and 1969, when the American Convention is drafted, is the Cold War. And it's the ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union and its allies, in which the United States, in the UN, the Universal Framework, works hard to separate the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which were intended to be a single covenant, a single convention with legally binding measures that would have transformed the UDHR into a treaty. That doesn't happen, so that the United States can preference civil and political rights over economic, social, and cultural rights. So that's part of the ugly history. In Latin America, that's largely true through the 50s and 60s in terms of rights guarantees, with some exceptions. The Mexican Constitution, there's more economic rights, certainly in Latin American law, and Professor Oquendo can talk about this with more authority than I can, in the 50s and 60s. But they really implement economic rights or internalize them in that process that Professor Oquendo was talking about, really in the transitional period. Again, broad strokes, different cases. Costa Rica is not Argentina, et cetera. I think now we're at a point where, in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, I am hopeful, as bleak as the current political context is, because today in the United States, there is more discourse, more recognition, particularly among younger generations, not my and Angel's generation, but among people who are 20 something, among people who are graduating from high school, among people who are voting for the first time. They talk in a way about the right to health, in a way that even 5 or 10 years ago, people didn't talk about in the United States. Obama did not push through Obamacare by referencing the right to health. It was about reducing cost expansion and greater access, et cetera. It wasn't about this as a fundamental, if it were a fundamental human right, the outcome would not have been Obamacare. It would have been something else very different, probably a single payer system. So I do think that there's hope, and that the current generation, younger folks, see economic injustice as affecting them, see housing costs, food insecurity, and other core, what are core economic rights as rights issues in ways that we did not see them in mainstream discourse 10 and certainly not 20, 30 years ago. So I think there's some hope there for institutionalizing human rights, because there's a greater discourse and there's a greater belief in it, particularly among, if you look at the data show the intergenerational theft that has occurred. And I say this as, I'm a beneficiary of intergenerational theft. I can afford to buy a house because I bought a house years ago and rolled it over to another house. I don't understand how in this country, someone who's 18, 20, 22, 24 years old can aspire to owning a house in New York or Boston or Los Angeles or Chicago. So I think people, because if they see those injustices, what's a response to injustice? Rights, and they see those things in rights frames in ways that we didn't. I've gone on, but I think there's a lot there in terms of hope.
Go ahead, Dr. Oquendo.
Yes, well, I agree with everything. And actually, I just wanted to point out that this issue was core one in the fight in the decade that is coming to an end now. You know, what I was referring to as the politicization of human rights, where you had the so-called Bolivarian axis challenging the inter-American institutions. And a central claim was that the system was paying far more attention to first generation rights than to second or third or fourth generation rights. And this was an enormous fight, and to some extent, it was a fight that was very effective for the dissidents within the system, because there had already been groundwork prior to their arrival at power. So just referring to the right to health again, it's very impressive what happened in terms of the national courts in Latin America with respect to the right to health, along with some other rights, second, third generation rights. So, you know, you had a lot of top tribunals in Latin America say, for instance, with respect to the AIDS crisis, if there is a right to health in the Constitution, it must mean, at a minimum, that those individuals who are about to die, if they don't get treatment, must get treatment. And then the courts said something beyond that. They said that it was not just about giving the sick medicine. It was about having a plan of prevention and treatment for the long term. And they insisted that there was an obligation not only to do this, but to find the money to do this. So this was already happening before this challenge to the inter-American systems. And I think that when the figures of Evo Morales or Rafael Correa or even Hugo Chavez at that time, to some extent also Daniel Ortega, started asking the inter-American system to pay more attention to these rights, there had been already this movement, and it's crucial to recognize it's not just a movement of domestic courts. Not all courts in Latin America responded positively. And at this point, I think the inter-American system was crucial, because then the plaintiffs would go to the inter-American system. In particular, in many of these cases, they'd get a preliminary injunction from the commission and start the process going in their land. So you had all of this going on. And then in the decade that we're just seeing come to an end now, you have a group of progressive governments come in and hit very hard on this. And of course, it's going to have an impact. And I have done no empirical work on this, but I suspect that there was an effect on the inter-American institutions in terms of these rights, because they were constantly under pressure. But then here, I guess we get to the other point, which I think underlies what Lucas is saying, and that is that it is a mistake. And this is something that was said at one point, I think very eloquently by the Constitutional Court in Peru. There is a connection between all rights, and it is just rhetoric, or it is distortion to say, no, we just have to focus on these rights and leave aside these other rights. You have to focus on everything. So, you know, if you are progressive, if you are for emancipation, yes, great. Second generation rights, third generation rights, right to health, right to work, all that sounds great. We have to answer the question, what does it mean? What role will the courts play? What role will the administration play? It's very complicated. We have to address that. But we cannot say, okay, for now, we're going to put aside the right of freedom of expression or the individual liberties or the right to privacy. No, you have to do everything at the same time, because everything hangs together. And if you just focus on certain rights, then the whole edifice is going to come down. And this is extremely tricky. It's tricky legally, it's tricky politically, it's terribly tricky ideologically. But this is the challenge that we have in front of us. Next.
Thank you so much. I think that is a really important observation and comment to make, particularly, I think looking at the United States that has for, many reasons, upheld this idea of, they're calling it identity politics, but in terms of sort of these very separate, identities or social groups that kind of have for a long time fought for their particular group's rights or, inequities. And I think that that's certainly, as I said before, the United States does a great job at dividing folks based on a lot of different things, but I think identity is certainly one of them. I am aware that we are about 10 of, so I just wanted to check in with our people to see if we should be closing out, or Lucas, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to hear anybody's closing comments, but I think, yeah, we're doing well.
Okay. Any last words before we close it up?
Shall we go in the order that we started? Or?
Great idea.
Okay. So
yeah, Dr. Cavalarro.
So thank you. Again, it's an interesting panel trying to bring together the Latin American experience in Latin America in and on human rights, impact on the framework and practice, and challenges to the Latinx community in the United States. In terms of what I can speak to, and I've said this before, but I would just emphasize, I think that we in the United States have a good deal to learn on economic rights, the kind of constitutional and legal interpretations of the Colombian constitutional courts and other courts on health rights that Professor Oquendo was referencing at a legal level. Understandings of rights that are particularly economic, social, cultural rights that are much thicker than what we have in the United States, for one. But two, also the way that people engage with their authorities, the way that people think about social change in Latin America, the things that organizations do, which I think are less, in many ways, less legal, even if the legal frameworks in some ways are more developed, and more organizational, more grassroots, more engaging the community to have an effect on policy. I think there's a lot there in the Latin American tradition that is useful, that we should leverage, that we can learn from, and that might move us someday, not in the short term, I recognize this, but in the midterm or long term, away from US exceptionalism, away from the idea of a beacon on a hill, to a place where we are one nation among many nations, where we respect international human rights standards because we respect human dignity. That's a place that we should have as our norte, right? As our goal, where we want to arrive. And we should be thinking about what we can learn from immigrant communities to help us overcome, because it's really about overcoming the limits, constraints, and intense strictures created by US exceptionalism. Not a blessing, a curse. And that's the way we need to embrace that. And that will require that we embrace the remarkable diversity and intelligence and experience of the communities in the United States that were maybe not born with those blinders.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Oquendo.
Yes, well, I want to just piggyback on what Professor Cavalarro said. I apologize for referring to you on a first name basis in this panel earlier. He mentioned the amparo, or the tutela, which I think is a very important institution in Latin America, which enables individuals to vindicate their constitutional and other rights. And this is an institution that developed in Mexico and spread out like wildfire. I don't know if I lost, have I lost connection?
No, you're good.
Okay, good. Throughout Latin America, from Tijuana to Tierra del Fuego. But Then there have been also very significant developments in terms of rights and enforcement of rights, as we've been saying, in the area of collective litigation. I think that we kept coming back to what Elisa was saying about the understanding of societal rights and the understanding of society and the understanding of the importance, and this goes back to what was said earlier, of being skeptical about institutions, to challenge institutions. I think that is all very important, and there are important lessons. Now, we have to be realistic. The United States is not very open to what comes from abroad, especially what comes from Latin America. And that is not going to change very easily. And it certainly is not going to disappear at the insistence of scholars. One thing that may make a difference in this area is the fact that the law in the United States is involuntarily becoming international. And that's not only because of globalization, but it's because of the citizenry. You know, the fact that there are a lot of foreigners here, and in particular in this case, there are a lot of Latin Americans in the United States, forces US law to be international. So if there is a divorce, if there is a dispute and it involves Latin Americans, then Latin American law is going to creep in, is going to come in, is going to have an effect. Judges, lawyers are going to be exposed to this. And they're going to have, I think, a very interesting opportunity to do some teaching about this perspective that Latin America can bring to the United States. And there might be a chance of being more effective than, you know, with writing books or writing articles, because, you know, we will see the law in action. It's not about idealizing the legal perspective in Latin America or the social perspective in Latin America. Of course, you know, we're all very critical, and we know that there are a lot of problems, but some of the problems that exist in the United States exist differently in Latin America. And maybe it'll be refreshing here to see what that perspective is when it comes to addressing the difficulties that have been faced in the United States. And I think that in this sense, this panel was conceived, I think, very creatively, very interestingly. So I want to congratulate the people who put it together, because I think that this is an opportunity precisely to start thinking about this, which is an issue that is often neglected. You know, what is the perspective that Latin America can bring? What can Latin America bring to the table? You know, there is the history that we've talked about, but there is also the present, and we can see a lot of change. And I think that here we have, I guess, the beginning of a little conversation on this that maybe will make some difference. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to give the last word to Emily Luna before I'll just make a little small closing at the end.
Yep. So just in closing, I just want to, you know, emphasize politically that we need to keep having these conversations about different issues, especially with human rights and Latinos here in the United States. And I just hope we all remain engaged going forward, especially from the 2020 election.
Thank you. So I want to say that I think what was really fabulous about this conversation, just as folks have said, I mean, it was a great combination, and we have to thank Lucas for the wonderful putting together of who was invited. And I think what's really striking to me is the idea that how much that you know, we have learned from Latin America in the past. I mean, in particular, when we're talking about human rights. And, you know, I think also what's interesting is, you know, we never thought as the United States that we would be in this place at all in terms of the way that our government is, you know, I guess, functioning or not functioning. And I think what we can also learn from Latin America, which, you know, has been said is, you know, maybe a healthy skepticism and mistrust of our government is important to have, and that we can't rest, I think, on the idea that we've got the we've got the, you know, best democracy around, and no one can beat it. And rather kind of, we need to be humble and, you know, look at some of the examples from Latin America that have occurred through the years, and also the contributions, obviously, that it's had in human rights. So I really want to thank you for your time, each one of you, for your thoughts, for your work on this particular, you know, issue within this particular context that we're in right now. And yeah, I just really appreciate all of you. So mil gracias. I hope all goes well, and vote on Tuesday, the next Tuesday, not, you know, on whatever Tuesday it is.
November 3rd.
November 3rd. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.